Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our weekly ANH workshop. Today we are in the number 29 workshop, and we have a special guest this morning. We have Dr. Pedro Restrepo, PhD, and he's going to talk to us about the renewal of the exploration portfolio for conventional hydrocarbons in Colombia, capture of CO2, and alternative energies. Okay, just showing you the chronogram of the technical workshop for September. So as I say, we have today Dr. Pedro Restrepo, and next week we're going to have a Friday off. It's just one. It's a family day in the ANH, and we're going to take that Friday off. But we will go back the following week with Dr. Carlos Molinares, who is going to talk to us about reservoir characterization for CO2 capture. And on September 23rd, we're going to have Dr. Daniel Andres Rincon from the ECP. He is going to talk about the Rio Magdalena ROFI project, land sea interaction of the major tributary of the Caribbean Sea. And the closure of these September talks are going to be done by Cesar Mora, Dr. Cesar Mora and Dr. Victor Ramirez. They are going to talk about gas play fairway assessment in Colombia basin, offshore and onshore with hydrocarbon commercial production. Well, October, we have a very interesting plan. We have on September 7th, we are going to have Dr. Andres Mesa from London. He's going to talk about global energy crisis and opportunity for Colombia. We will have on September 14th, Dr. Brian Frost, who's going to talk to us about the petroleum prospectivity, potential, and risks in the ultra-deep water Colombia basin. On October 21st, we're going to have John Munoz, Paula Arcila, and Fabian Gallego talking about the structural styles within the Colombian Caribbean basins in the relationship with the thermogenic hydrocarbon evidence. October 28th, the last talk of the month, is going to be done by Carlos Molinares, the hard task of increasing production and reserves in Colombia, EOR, exploration offshore and onshore. Don't forget that we have that the agency during this year has identified very interesting areas for gas or condensate, and you can address that information in our website. There in the bottom, you see the link. You can address any of that information there, PDFs and recording presentation for if you want to be in how to say to have knowledge on those talks given previously by the ANH. Okay, let me just talk to you about our speaker today. Dr. Pedro Restrepo is a PhD geology. From the University of Arizona, structural geology, tectonics, geochronology, and isotope geochemistry. He's a master scientist as well in geology from the University of Arizona. In tectonics, he's a Bachelor of Geology, magna cum laude from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. He has 25 years of experience in the oil and gas industry sector with a structural and basin modeling expertise, basin evaluation for project generation, oil finder, Colombia, Vietnam, Malaysia, extensive knowledge-based experience and multitude of geological settings, basins and countries, NOC and IOC experience, management team lead and technical lead experience, generalist and specialist technical skills, work over 60 basins from more than 20 countries. So Dr. Pedro Restrepo currently works in Petronas. He is a head of structural geology in the EGRS. He also worked as an oil search in Australia, Alaska, as a chief geoscientist. In Murphy Oil Corporation, he was senior geological advisor in new ventures. In Mubadala Petroleum in Thailand, he was chief geologist. In Mubadala Oil and Gas, Kuala Lumpur, he was chief geologist in an exploration manager. In Lundin, Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, he was senior exploration geologist. In Lundin Petroleum, Singapore, he was senior exploration geologist for the Southeast Asia. In Shell Exploration, in Houston, he was a principal regional geologist in new ventures. In Ecopetrol in Colombia, Bogota, he used to be a vice president of the exploration division there. In ConocoPhillips in Indonesia, Jakarta, he was senior exploration geologist, also structural geology advisor. In Conoco Incorporation, he was in technology Houston. He used to be a TX Technology Integrated Interpretation Center. He worked there as in structural basing. Modeling group as well in Conoco, and structural geology in the modeling group, he worked as a structural geology expert. In Conoco in Houston as well, and in the group, the new ventures, as senior exploration geologist. And Exxon, he also worked in Exxon in Houston as a senior exploration geologist in frontier areas. In Shell, PEC-10 International Houston as well as junior geologist, and in Shell Offshore New Orleans as a junior geologist. Well, as you can see, Dr. Pedro Restrepo has a very extensive experience in the oil and gas industry. It is a pleasure for us to have Dr. Pedro Restrepo with us. And don't forget that we will go back on September 16 with a special guest, Dr. Carlos Molinari, a PhD, who's going to talk about reservoir characterization for CO2 capture. So don't forget, next Friday, we're going to have a Friday off. But we will go back on September 16. Well, Dr. Pedro Restrepo, welcome to the ANA's Technical Talks on Fridays, and it's a pleasure to have you here, okay?
Gracias, Miguel. Can you guys hear me all? Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay. So let me see if I share screen. Can you see a PowerPoint presentation? Is that fine now? Can you see the opening slide?
Yes, put it in presentation. That's it.
Let me see. Wow, this is not good. Zoom quit unexpectedly? No, I don't know. You can still see me, huh?
We see it, but you can maybe put it in presentation.
Okay. I don't know what this, do not ask me again. Okay. All right. Buenas noches a todos. I guess voy a hablar en inglés. Miguel me comenta que estas charlas se hacen en inglés, so I will speak in English. As I think there's a wider audience from the wider industry in Colombia, so that I shall speak in English. So that's the first disclaimer. And the second disclaimer is, well, there's a few disclaimers. What I'm going to show is probably nothing new. And you might find it maybe a little bit mundane. Maybe it's, but I'm just trying to generate a few ideas from a person who's been a little bit outside of the loop since I left Colombia a while ago. I was VP of Ecopetrol from 2003 to 2005. And a lot has happened both in Colombia and in the industry since. So it's become a very, it's a complicated industry these days. So we'll talk a little bit in this presentation about the context, perhaps a little bit locally, but mostly globally. Then I'll show you a bunch of cartoons with some ideas that are very simple. Of things that I think are very simple but very important, and finally I'll throw some very I'm a bit of an opinionated person, And I should apologize to the audience up front. I am extremely candid. I'm not a politician. I don't use social media. So I really, but I abide by my ethics and my love for my profession. So please do not be, this is not a personal issue, so please do not be offended by any comments that I might have about anything. These are just personal opinions, which matter or may not matter at all. But mostly, let's try to keep this professional. I'll talk a little bit about the issue of transition to new energies and things that I wonder about, because I'm also part of the team in Petronas that we're dealing with the same issues like everybody. So let's get on with the presentation. So the two first things, the two opening statements are one cannot resolve a problem in the same way that it was created. And the other one is something that is very close to my heart. My father was a painter, an artist. So I think our profession is an art. Unfortunately, the artistic part of our profession, like many other things, keep fading with time. I see no more people cartooning. Everybody is straight into the screen. All they can believe is seismic information, which we all know is not geology, or at least some of us don't think it's geology. And then we get all the external pressures that the business has. So I'm going to bring you back a little bit in history. This is about 20 years ago almost. And this is a time when I was VP of Ecopetrol. So let's say about 2002 or 2003. So there were a couple of things that were very important in the industry that were happening. So the context was very different at that time. I was brought into Ecopetrol as a very inexperienced person. I was roughly about 40 years old or so. Structural geologist. I had very little business experience. I was a purely technical person. And at that time, Isaac Yanovich was the president of Ecopetrol, interviewed me. For whatever reason, I got into the radar of Ecopetrol, so they interviewed me. And I went into the office as usual with my blue jeans. I never wear a tie. I don't like ties. I used to go to Ecopetrol on a bicycle. I had a driver, but I never had a armored vehicle or any of those fancy things. I'm not interested in any of that. So I went into with my blue jeans, and Isaac Yanovich says, "What do you know how to do?" I said, "Well, I'm a geologist and I know how to interpret seismic, and I do my best to try to find oil and gas." And he said, "Well, the situation is that we're about to, as we're going, the production is declining, and it looks like we're going to start importing oil somewhere around 2010 or 2013, maybe. So is there anything you can do to help us?" I said, "Well, I'll do my best, but I was a bit of a rookie at that time." So I said, "Well, I'll do my best." And he said, "Do you know anything about business?" I said, "Well, I barely know how to put my ATM card in the machine and get money. As my father used to say, I don't worry about money because I have none." So he said, "Well, don't worry about that because Ecopetrol is full of finance people and lawyers." So, which was very good because at least I had a lot of capable people to do a bunch of stuff that I didn't know how to do, which I learned a little bit how to do eventually. So this was the context. And there was another portion to the context at that time, was that the ANH was being created. And at the same time, Ecopetrol was being separated, pretty much like a lot of state oil companies had gone through, like in the case of Petronas or Pertamina or many other companies, they had a regular a branch that was separated into more of a regulatory or basically a state control portion, whereas allowing the oil and gas company to do what they thought they can do best, which is try to find oil and gas and replace the goods, bring the goods home. So there were a bunch of things going on, and it was interesting. And then the contracts were also changed. So this is all history. This was the context 20 years ago. And then me, in my sort of very simplified view of the world, I designed together with I had 106 people working with me in Ecopetrol, a lot of people who knew a lot more of what the business was than I did. But I had a little bit of a flavor of the outside, which was kind of good. And I also had another big benefit, which was my ignorance. Ignorance is a great thing to have in this business, because you have no bias, you have no pressures from outside, you're not a politician, so you have a certain degrees of freedom that people don't have when you're part of the inside. And I've never been part of the inside anywhere. I'm basically a hippie. So I designed an exploration strategy, and these are actually the slides that I used at that time. These are original slides from those days, and it had to do with, I had an inherited portfolio. It was about 22 blocks, exploration blocks, that Ecopetrol had. We had a portfolio of opportunities. Many of these opportunities had been just circulating for years in Ecopetrol, but never were drilled. They were not particularly the most beautiful things to drill, but that's what we had. Then I decided, well, let's try to do a little bit of a review and see where we want to position ourselves as the acreage was starting to churn, because the ANH also started to appear, and they were going to reorganize the way the acreage was distributed. So let's try to position ourselves and leverage Ecopetrol with the places where we really can do an impact, and what we want to keep and what we want to return back to the ANH. We were obliged to return a bunch of acreage to the ANH, so the ANH could start promoting outside. And then we had a couple of blocks offshore, Harada and Bahia, I think, small blocks. Well, small relative to the overall offshore. And then so that were kind of dormant, had a very small team working on them, but nobody really cared. Ecopetrol didn't know how to swim those days. Nobody in Ecopetrol had offshore experience, very little. So people had to go to the pool and learn how to swim. Basically never, with the exception of Chuchupa and Ballena, there was nothing going on out there for about 17 years, since the BP guys and other companies were there. The companies from the past, they left the Caribbean, and that was it. So I say, okay, well, there's that, which is high risk, and then there's the other, which is onshore, which is what we know how to do. And then there was another thing that actually Tomas, my predecessor and colleague, started, which was trying to sniff around to make Ecopetrol international. So I said, well, let's give it a real push and try to make if we can't find the resource in Colombia, maybe we can look around and put a criteria as to how we want to jump out of Colombia. So we did set up a criteria. Alberto Tovar was very instrumental in this. He's a very clever guy, and we put together some kind of a criteria around it, and we decided to go a little bit, and with the guys of the heads of Ecopetrol, we started steering as to try to go shy, try to go close, for example, Ecuador and South America, and then think a little bit far. And now Ecopetrol is what it is. It's it's gone beyond. Okay, so in that context,
Disculpe, Pedro, es que la presentación se quedó en la primera imagen y no está en pantalla completa. No,
¿no? Miércoles,
no sé si
entonces,
pueda detener el compartir la pantalla, volver a compartirla.
y un anuncio de Don't Send, que de pronto me va a tocar, bueno, vamos a ver si no me obliga a recomenzar, porque vamos a ver, ¿qué ven ahora?
No se sigue viendo lo mismo, no, no se ve nada. Le voy a detener desde acá el compartir para que por favor vuelva a compartir. ¿Listo?
Porque tengo un
Listo.
bueno, vamos a ver otra vez. ¿Ahora qué ven?
Espérate, a ver. Ah, ahora sí, movió. Perfecto. Ahora sí.
Ah, bueno.
¿Puede colocar en pantalla completa, por favor? En la parte inferior derecha.
Ah, ya,
Ahora
perfecto.
sí. Ahora sí.
Bueno, este era el cuento, rápidamente, este era el cuento de la intersección entre la producción bajando y la demanda subiendo y el punto crítico en el 2010. ¿Sí? Y esta es los slides directamente de las presentaciones de ANH, de cuando la ANH se creó, se gestó y cómo se dividía, how you divided Ecopetrol into two entities and how the contract was changing. Yeah. And then this is the slide of the strategy that from the original slides of Ecopetrol, you can see the dates, which was a three-pronged strategy, work on the portfolio, try to focus on the areas that we had a little bit of leverage and try to make ourselves international. In the meantime, use the offshore as a possibility to bring bigger players into the country, right? Ahora sí están viendo todo, ¿no? Sí.
Sí, perfecto.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So now we're in the slide where the thing of the offshore started. So I'm going to be I'm not going to be modest here. I actually set up this trick. The trick was we have offshore. It's very risky from the geological side of things and from the commercial side of things. I'm talking 2003, okay? So relax. But there's a big area. And 17 years with no activity. So this is kind of the context. So I said, okay, so how can I throw some bait to bring some players into here? Because Ecopetrol had no offshore capacity. Nobody in Ecopetrol knew anything about offshore, aside from Chuchupa and Ballena, which is, I actually went diving under Chuchupa. It's only 18 meters deep. So, so I said, okay, we had Petrobras. So I called Lincoln Guardado. Lincoln Guardado was the exploration manager of Petrobras. I say, hey man, look, since you guys are kind of at the leading edge of, in these days, in offshore, because Petrobras had even in those days had beaten certain, had gold medal and silver medals in deep water drilling. I said, hey guys, can I actually use you guys to look? I'll give you a big acreage holding offshore if I can convince the ANH. And then I bluntly told Lincoln, I will utilize your capacity to leverage myself into luring partners who will foot part of the bill. And Lincoln said, sure, that sounds good. So that's what I did. So I said, okay, the first thing is talk to Petrobras, and then talk to Ion Geophysical and lay out a deep record survey. So I said, I will shoot this at $14,000 a kilometer. I'll shoot the whole survey offshore. And then I will provide this on a free basis to anybody who wants to look at the offshore. And then try to lure them in. In the meantime, I'm having heavy negotiations with the ANH, because the ANH had other plans for the offshore. They decided that we had Bahia and Harada, and that Tayrona, which is the blue block shown on the little inset and exhibit A on the right side of the diagram. They said, that's too big for you guys. And the ANH wanted to start promoting. So they said, if we give you Ecopetrol, you already have 22 blocks. If we give you this big block, then the ANH has nothing to offer. So we went back and forth until I convinced him that only a big acreage position and providing them seismic can bring companies in. Well, it did work. My strategy worked by triangulating between Petrobras, the large acreage position, the IN data. I managed to bring in Exxon. That only started the problems because Exxon and Petrobras didn't like each other very much. But we managed to get ahead. So this is how the offshore started. And then you guys know more about the offshore than I do, because ever since I've not been very connected, and there's been some success, and that I'll leave it right there. This is the original layout conversations, and you can see emails, the original emails and conversations, and the people involved in these conversations on the layout of the original IN survey. And this was the original presentations of the agreement with the ANH. So this was all very good news. And this was the presentation. I went on a road show and I tried to, I played the game between Shell and Exxon, and Shell was a little bit slow, and Exxon actually put their foot ahead. So Shell dropped to the second tier. So Exxon walked in with Petrobras, and then Shell came later. So this is kind of the story. So this was the strategy, and that was the context. So, and these has a little bit of a timeline of the interactions that took to do this deal. It was not an easy task, believe me. There was a lot happening back there. It took quite a while until the actual announcement came to my email, which is shown here, and you can recognize some names. And there's a couple of interesting things in this little inset that says about the agreement. It also talks about the ANH and the new terms, and it also talks about the production of Colombia those days was 528,000 barrels of oil per day. So this brings everybody into the context of those days. Very interesting times. And here is a little conversation that Alberto Tovar and myself and some of the guys in Ecopetrol had is, okay, when we get these guys on the table, what are we going to ask them, and how are we going to play this game? So these are actually internal communications of us, and what sort of questions we're going to put. So the deal was closed. Okay. And these were personal notes that I had on my emails as to how to strategize and how to close out the deal and the whole thing. So it came to fruition. So now, today, a very different world. This is 20 years ago. The industry had 2014, it had a big upset. And then COVID came and we had another big upset. So, but now, today, we have a situation which is also very transient, as our industry, this is what our industry is all about. It's the opposite, up and down. It keeps us always quite nervous. So we're back into high prices, and thanks to Mr. Vladimir up in Russia. And to the demise of our poor Ukrainian friends, but that's the way it is. But that might be also a very transient event. So we need to keep that in mind as when this ceases to happen, and if Iran renews their agreement with the U.S., they're currently putting about a million barrels of oil in the market. If the agreement comes in, they'll put 2.5 million barrels. Plus, if Russia stops the war, then the prices are going to come down most likely. So there is a window of opportunity. So for Colombia, for the conventional resource, there's an opportunity. So we need to move quickly because Colombia is not a rich country. So we need the revenue, right? So, and it has to be fast, fast and furious. There's 105 companies that have cut 30% of their exploration budget, about $82 billion worldwide. Not to say the amount of people that are still circulating in the street. So I'm very grateful that I still have a job. I don't know for how long, but this is the way it is. And then there's another aspect to this, that we're under a lot of pressure from the transition world. Suddenly, after 30 years of trying to ignore this problem or trying to dodge it somehow, the pressure is coming up, and the pressure is coming through mostly through the banks, because any project that needs financing, the banks are basically going to scrutinize how clean the project is going to be, which is kind of I'm not going to talk about banks. They're not particularly my best friends, but we know how it goes. It's all about money. So, and every time the banks go broke, we all bail them out. But when the oil companies go broke, nobody bails us out. So that's the way it is. That's the way the world spins. And then to compound to all these other layers, we have a new government in Colombia. Some happy, some maybe not. It is a change. I think probably an important change in Colombia, because it's unsustainable. Really, Colombia is a very suffered country. So might as well experiment something new, because there's a lot of incredible poverty in Colombia that needs to be addressed. So I think it's very important. Something had to happen. So that's where it is. So we have this ups and downs, which we're all familiar with. And then there's things that we can do for the conventional world that we live in still within this short window of opportunity. So far in this 20 years, and I'm going to say what I can perceive from the outside. So I apologize if I'm completely incorrect on this slide, but this is what I view from the outside. I'm looking at the bullfight from the stages, viendo a los toros desde la barrera. Most of the production in Colombia was bumped up to the present days at around 750,000 barrels of whatever, about that number, by increasing the production on some existing fields like Castilla and Rubiales and other things that we had around. There was also additions, not big additions, but there were additions of smaller fields, and mostly by independent smaller companies. Today, there's I think about 8 companies, including Ecopetrol, that manage the majority of the acreage in Colombia. And a lot of them are medium or small independents that are quite efficient and nimble. Then there was the heavy oil stuff that also had the heyday and helped us quite a bit. And then the offshore, which so far has had success, but the commercial aspects of it are still up in question. So what what can we do in a short time, or how I think we should think about the short time, is that we can continue to work on the traditional areas that we've exploited since 1918, La Cida Infantas, till today. So it's 100 and whatever years that we've been doing this business. But what now the conventional areas need unconventional thinking, and unconventional thinking means sometimes, and please don't be offended, but it's the same thing like in politics. We need to recycle a little bit the people, including myself maybe, that pontificate about the geology of Colombia, because there's a confirmation bias system of a very small clan of people that continue to view the geology through the same spectacle. So it requires a bit more lateral thinking, a bit of freedom, and less thought about your personal gratifications and your personal career and your personal prestige, and more about loving your science. I'm saying this because I'm also Colombian, so I know my people. So that's one thing. So it requires lateral thinking with new people, or the old people, but being willing to be open and candid about their mistakes. Like myself, a good explorer is a guy that makes a lot of mistakes. That's me, for example. I've made a lot of dry holes, believe me. So, and then the frontier basins requires that lateral thinking plus. So you got to put a turbocharger. So you need more technology. You need a market, because sometimes you're using resources that are not easy to market, and to the volumes that are not easy to market. So it requires imagination, not only from the geoscience, but from the commercial people, from the regulatory people, from legal, from everybody. So it's a joint effort. Okay. So I think I'm not saying anything new, but I'm just reminding people what needs to be done. Sometimes people just get on with the business of the day to day, hoping that they can retire before the whole thing collapses. Put the coat on, the jacket on the chair, get the paycheck, and wait for 65. Well, that's not the way this thing goes. If we're gonna go, we're gonna go with style, like the Ukrainians. Okay. So let's look at our backyard. This is our traditional area, what we think we know the best, where we've gotten most of our resource. If I would visit this, I would go back maybe 40 years. We've done a lot of things here, and we thought about this problem in many ways. And a lot of it has been perspiration and very little inspiration. I think we need to go back to some fundamentals, old school stuff. Look back at the surface geology. When you're in the onshore, you can touch the petroleum system. You can hammer it. You can visit it. You can visit it every day. You can embrace and kiss La Luna source rock every day if you're enamored with it. You can touch the Mirador and caress it and dream and songs, love songs every day. You can't do that offshore. To do that offshore, you have to mobilize a rig and poke a hole. So you need seismic. So the leverage is geophysics in the offshore. In the onshore, it's geology. But we have been in this exercise of shooting seismic and seismic and seismic, and we no longer go and touch the rocks. Well, those rocks, I remember in a conversation with Isaac Yanovich and Tony Hayward, BP, having a conversation about drilling Niscota. And Presidente Uribe was sitting on the table, and we're all sitting at the same table. And Presidente Uribe tells Tony Hayward, "Hey, what can we do to entice BP to drill an exploration well? Because BP had been sitting and sucking oil and gas for 20 years, but not doing a lot of exploration." So it was a bona fide question. So Tony Hayward answered on the other side of the table, "Can you change the rocks?" So this was a little bit like the answer he gave after the Macondo well. Said, can I get my life back? I felt like going under the table that day. So, but in many ways, he's actually right. The rocks are there. You can't change them. The petroleum system is there. So I think maps have to change. But now there's a technology that is out there. It's been there for a while, but I think it's subutilized. So I'm going to take you to Papua New Guinea. I've been working in Papua New Guinea, and the approach, it's a full belt onshore, a lot more complicated than Colombia, believe me. It's a lot more difficult physically. It's almost impenetrable. It's very sparse population. There's no roads. It's very difficult to get to. So here's the typical problem. You got satellite images, and you got GeoSAR, and you got other ways of doing maps. In Colombia, most of the maps, the cartography was being done by photogeology, by mapping, and by field campaigns. There's only a few field groups that still operate in Colombia. There was a period in which was very difficult because it was dangerous to go out. But not a lot of people go back to the field to do control. But now there's LiDAR, and LiDAR has been around, but it's not utilized with the effort that I think is important. So a lot of the maps, the geological maps, which are the basis of onshore exploration, because that's in the hierarchy of data, geology maps are number one, wells are number two, and seismic are number three, in my view, for onshore exploration. So you can use LiDAR to reposition and fix those maps. A lot of those maps are, the contacts are completely in the wrong position. It's like 2D versus 3D. The culminations are in the wrong place. The maps are distorted. The contexts are distorted. The units are distorted. The way that we looked at geology 30 years ago was different. So the interpretations that start from the surface down are mostly wrong. And there's a lot of wells out there that I suspect are positioned in the wrong places. So this is the typical topography of Papua New Guinea, not very different from going to Rio Minero and Middle Mag. Highly vegetated, high topography, very difficult to get to, right? So this is the idea, right? So you get your typical image photogeology, but if you fly LiDAR with no intervention whatsoever on humans, you can strip out all the vegetation with no impact, no problems of surface, at a cost of, I don't know, maybe less. The whole survey is less than 1 kilometer of 2D linear seismic. If you add a slope map to these images, you can actually do pretty good geological maps on an area of very inaccessible. And you can relate that to the subsurface geology. This is a field up in Papua New Guinea with the surface topography related to the seismic geology. And you can actually slice and dice and do a lot of very interesting geology and do some post-drill analysis As shown here in this case, you can see that this well is not in an optimal position on that 2D seismic line. Okay, so this is your typical area, an area which I did field geology in Papua New Guinea. That shows another aspect, interesting aspect when you shoot LiDAR, is that this harmony, the structural disharmony between the lower units and the upper units. So sometimes the surface geology can be deceiving as a target for your subsurface geology. The wavelength of the structures that are happening in the deeper, because there's a partitioning of the strain vertically, then there's targets down deeper that may not be well envisioned, and you can calibrate your seismic interpretations by doing this. And obviously do your maps, right? Another thing that you can do is optimize your seismic. This is a typical karstic topography on the carbonates, the Miocene carbonates in Papua New Guinea. Well, it turns out that those have very deep holes, these karsts, in which you're trying to shoot some seismic. Here's a typical hole, one of those karstic holes, in which you're going to shoot the 2D seismic. In Papua New Guinea, they do these bridges. Bridges are these paths made of wood, in which the natives, the Papuans, with machetes and nails put together 4 kilometers, that allow you to put the geophones and lay out the equipment and bring the compressors to put the charges in. But when you shoot the LiDAR, you can actually avoid this hole, so you don't have a gap on your seismic. And you can, these are the typical bridges that you do, 4 kilometers. So it's a bit more treacherous than in Colombia. And this is a typical path for a seismic line, in which I'm doing the seismic control, and you can see the scale. Well, you can optimize where that seismic line is going to be laid with the LiDAR by slope maps. Okay, so I'm going to leave the LiDAR subject there as something for you guys to think about. Here is a typical area in Colombia with a geological map. And I'm not going to go through a bunch of labels. These are, you can take any geological map in Colombia, and I can tear any map in Colombia and tear it apart in pieces with all kinds of inconsistencies. Not because the mappers are bad, it's just because the mapping is difficult. But there are ways of improving it. So I'm trying to stress the point that everything starts here. The contacts, most of these contacts and faults that you draw and you interpret it and you try to push down in the seismic are probably not well positioned. The contact units, the thicknesses of the units, and the interpretations that go into the subsurface are generally very dubious, are questionable. The positions of the wells, the positions of very old wells that have shows, that's when you have to do a lot of forensics. Just think of Triton. Triton did good forensics and brought BP to execute a well that found Cusiana. That's what you call forensics. People who actually go and look at the wells and see how the maps change. What other interpretations? This is I'm just going to show you a bunch of cartoons fast about all the inconsistencies between maps. This thing that looks like the dog's breakfast is 2 maps laid upon each other with different contexts, different faults, representing the same geology. If you spread these 2 maps, they look like 2 different worlds in the same area. If you lay them one on top of the other, you can see all kinds of inconsistencies. Which map are you going to believe on? Right? This is an example of LiDAR in Colombia, shot in Colombia. So you can see the quality and the resolution of what you can do in Colombia. So we're not talking Papua New Guinea anymore. This is a typical example of Colombia resolution, 50 centimeters on the ground. It's beautiful data in which you can actually do very good geology. And then you can send your field crew to do spot checks to improve your resolution of your mapping to 80 or 90%. Measure the thicknesses, correct all kinds of distortions from the old maps. Here's a slanted view where you can actually see beautiful structures in the LiDAR. There's beautiful syncline, there's closures, there's anticlines, there's all kinds of things that you can trace. There's things that have to do with planning, how you bring the rig, how you plan your seismic, how you manage your area with no intervention with people. Here are the multiple versions of the same map. This is the map derived from the LiDAR, from that LiDAR example that I showed, with the seismic laid on top of it, which has provided a new interpretation and has opened new possibilities into an area of exploration held by a company. Okay, so I'm going to leave you that with a little bit of food for thought as a possibility. It's a very cheap possibility of something that is technology that is in your hand, that you can think of areas, for example, in Putumayo, very difficult to access, both physically and also on the ground because of social issues. Think of all the problems that the maps have. Here I put some observations of the maps. You can strip out what the map is telling you. You can provide an alternative interpretation to the map, view the map in a different way, think how the map can actually happen, right? Try to do some experiments, then probably look at your seismic, make a hypothesis of what you can potentially come up with. This is your classical sort of basement involved structure. Is there a way of closing the reservoir up there with some kind of other closure? Is there something that you can do with the LiDAR to help you sort out the surface geology and improve this geological map so your seismic interpretation gains constraints from the wells that are mostly in the foreland, and you can tackle the fold belt in a proper way? Okay. Here's an example, going back to Ecopetrol. This is a typical line that we had in the upper mag. This was our original prospect. In those days, we had a problem with the pump, with one of the pumps in the rig. So I decided to take a flight down because I wasn't I was a bit suspect about the problem that the pump had. And I didn't know if they were just trying to stretch the rig time and just charge us day rate. So I was very suspicious. As a good Colombian, not very trustworthy of anybody. So I did take a flight, and I went with my guys down there. Right there is, I think there's Carlos Guerrero, and I can see Javier Sanchez. Yeah, some of my guys, we went down there. Some effectively, yeah, the pump was down. They were trying to fix it. So I said, hey, why don't we go and take a stroll and look at the geology while they work on the pumps? So we did. Well, it turns out that as we were drilling the guaduas, we had been in guaduas for about 700 meters and not coming out of it. It turns out that the interpretation was nothing like this, but it was actually more like this. And that came from walking through that creek, and we discovered that the reservoir that we were trying to drill was already breached. So here we go again. If we would have had the LiDAR and we would have had our maps correct, we probably would have avoided drilling this well where we drilled it. So this is why I say in humble ways that I have drilled my share of dry holes as well. I'm a culprit of this, participant of this problem. But we need to get ahead and fix it. There's a lot of these opportunities out there that you can think about. Seismic is not geology. You know about this. The guys who worked in foothills. Now, this is the same line processed while drilling 5 times. This is while drilling. The same line. The pre-drill and the post-drill, and look at the maps. They did borehole seismic, and they drilled a well that was 7,000 meters deep. So, you know, if you only rely on seismic and you don't have your surface geology correct, you could have saved yourself maybe a lot of money with the surface geology. Okay, chapter number 2. Potential fields. Potential fields have been in and out of industry, blah, blah, blah. You know, some people use it. Some people think it's a bunch of blah, blah. The wavelength of what you're trying to resolve maybe doesn't help you much, but it does try, it can help you open plays in very mature areas. So let's go back to Papua New Guinea. These are a set of maps produced by Frogtech, a company that went belly up, but now it's called Geognostics out of Australia. They used to do these maps for Shell worldwide, and they were called sea-based. Very high quality inversion maps from gravity and magnetics. And I'm not going to go in detail, but this is the typical sea-based map in Papua New Guinea. The black line is the coastline. The sort of rugged center area of cream colors is the highlands, let's say La Cordillera Oriental. And then the foreland to the southwest, where it says Mapa de Basamento, to the west, which is color orange. That's the foreland, Los Llanos Orientales. And the area of high production, the 4 deep, is the blues, onshore and offshore. Let's see if I don't know if I have a pointer or if you, let's see, do I have a pointer options. So this is kind of like the Piedemonte. This is Los Llanos Orientales. This is La Cordillera Oriental. This is the foreland. This is the coastline, okay? So most of the fields discovered are right here. So Cusiana, Cupiagua, whatever. Here called Hides and Gobi and whatever. So the trend of production fields are here. A few here in the foreland. Nothing here in the hinterland. But here in the hinterland, there's a lot of oils and gas seeps. So that created a lot of attention. I'm not going to go through this animation, which is just drainage on that map. I'll let you, this is a little bit so you can get a sense of what the topography is all about, right? But here's the map of oil and gas occurrences, fields, and seeps. The oil fields are all situated here, but here in the hinterland, there's quite a bit of oil and gas seeps. But there's a big low. Well, if you put a little bit of geology there, this is kind of, let's say, this is a Toro, which is the main reservoir. It's also Cretaceous. Let's call it, this is the equivalent sort of like a Mirador. But the distal equivalents of that Mirador have never been tapped. And there is a play of the low stands of this sand down here, which hasn't been investigated. And that can only be illuminated by these maps, these gravity and magnetic maps. And then you can conceptualize, and there's a lot of knowledge from all these 100 years of geological and stratigraphic knowledge of all the papers that are being presented constantly about all the reservoirs in Colombia, that you can actually work this problem out in great deal, not only for structural, but for strat traps. So talking about another use of these gravity and magnetic highs, here's a big high straddling the offshore here and the onshore, which created some tension because it was within the fairway of a discovery field here in carbonates, which were related to these highs where reefal carbonates were seeded. So we located a high in the gravity where a potential carbonates could be on trend with a big 5 TCF discovery here. And we mapped it out, laid out some potential reserves. And this is the seismic related to that. This is the reprocessed seismic, which illuminates these high impedance events, which are these carbonates. And it turns out to be this closure here, which is the biggest prospect that Oil Search has in Papua New Guinea these days, which is approximately 10 TCF potential onshore. Okay, so how you calibrate these things, the importance of merging the geology from the offshore into the onshore, as imperfect as it may be, you got some calibration offshore and you got some calibration onshore from the geological maps. The issue is to bringing both things together into a coherent story, right? To create a prospect. And that's, I'm calling that attention because you guys have these regional seismic lines that are tied all the way onshore and offshore. So that reconciling that story, I know it's been done. I know that the ANH has a lot of studies about it. I know there's companies working on this problem. There's discoveries around here. There's discoveries down here. But thinking laterally, you can always push the limits of your data and come up with new concepts. The merging of seismic data. You know, the edges of seismic data are tricky. Seismic merges are important because in a lot of these seismic merges, there are things that are of interest. Okay, so that's, and then finally, the Llanos Orientales. I'm going to take you to Vietnam. If you map out, if you use coarse mapping, which is all these big horizons, you're going to miss out on all the nuances of the high resolution mapping. You're mapping at this scale. You need to map at this scale to try to identify geobodies of interest, which are strat plays. In this case, a strat play here, which is a prograding margin delta from a lake, which is an area that has been captured by Murphy. 2 billion barrels of oil in place, 15% recovery. It's 100 and somewhat million barrels of oil, of recoverable oil. Here's the extraction of that geobody. And here's using the analog from China of that proven play, plastering at the same scale in the basin and see how many of these opportunities you can have in the basin. And you could do some yet to find and then try to chase other acreage positions in the Llanos. The Llanos has lots of 3D. You have to merge them. You have to map them in high detail and get into the weeds to get the strat plays. Here's a typical strat play in the margin of the Malay Basin. This is what it is. They drilled this first well, which was a gas discovery. Then they went down dip and they discovered the oil leg. Finally, the other idea that I have is maps of corredores económicos. The ANH can draw these just like the CRS maps, fairway maps, is a map of value, which has to do with all the facilities, the infrastructure, the pipelines, the fluids. And so it allows you to position yourself and the companies to where they want to be with the economic layover on top of the acreage map. I'm not going to go in details, but think about it. It's a map which shows the economy of your fluids and your facilities. Okay, so some actions in the future. Piedemonte, we talked about fix the surface geology. Llanos, go to strat traps. Second, information should be public domain after 5 years. Within held acreages and without held acreages, it doesn't matter. If you put all this information in public domain, ideas will flourish. Colombia will become the Oklahoma of Latin America. Just give it to people to think about, and there'll be thousands of plays generated. I know all the issues around it. I know all the legal issues around it. I'm not going to talk here about legalities. That's something that can be worked out. If a person has an acreage position and somebody else has data that is 5 years older and he's got a good idea, then come knocking at my door. Bring me a proposition. You got a good idea, I'll drill it. And if you have a good idea and I don't want to drill it, I just want to sit in the acreage, then maybe it's time for me to turn back the acreage to the country. So it'll put pressure to the operators to do what is right for the country. within this short time frame that we have a high oil prices and within the transition period. So the best incentive to generate ideas is to let the data roam freely to everybody. Invite companies directly within the scope of the reality of Colombia. Colombia is not Saudi Arabia. I think we all know that by now. Middle independents are very successful onshore. Offshore, the big muscle is required because the cost of putting any kind of facility out there. But they also have a lot of more interesting places to find gas. For example, Tanzania, 54 TCF of gas compared to Colombia, Uchua. So you have to be realistic of what you're trying to do, right? Invite companies directly. I know there's an issue of transparency. Everything can be worked out. Colombia has 55 million people living there, probably 49 and a half are lawyers. And if not, they're lawyer aficionados. So I'm sure that you can put something together to help make it transparent. How you do that? You select 3 or 4 companies that you know have a good trajectory of being good executors, and you say, okay, I'm going to invite you to these 2 or 3 blocks, and you put the 3 to compete. And if anything, if the acreage is a bit high risk, then you force marriage them so they can share the risk. That's a typical procedure that many places is done, and also open the industry to companies with conditions that may not be. We know all the legal issues regarding transparency and funny monies in Colombia. It's difficult to open industry to anybody around, but there's got to be legal ways in which you can bring small companies to find oil and gas. Between 5 and 10 million barrels, you can get a long way, and you can reactivate industry. So I think it's more about the medium and small players than the big guys. Energía por alimentos. We've been with Venezuela on this fight of flag waving, because we both need each other. The hatred between Venezuela and Colombia is needed because the Colombian government needs Venezuela as their to blame for everything, and the Venezuelans need Colombia to blame everything. So instead of talking about exchanging lower cost energy for food and medicine, which would have been the most sensible thing for 2 countries that have exactly the same culture and the same interest. I know this is very political, but you know, I think it's time that we start being practical about our lives. There's a lot of things that between Venezuela and Colombia we can do in very good ways, without having to go into. It's a transactional issue that we can help each other. If we can find the resource, they got the resource, but they also need our food and our industry to help them. So we help each other. Los congresos técnicos. I apologize if there's people here from APG and all these other things. I think it's time that ANH takes charge of the local congresos, because it'll utilize it as an area of exchange of prospects. So you can actually, instead of putting a lot of people pontificating about how they're going to change the geology in 15 minutes that was created in 100 million years, I think it's more useful for the country to have a forum where people actually come with propositions that are going to be tested by the lie detector. And the lie detector is called the well. There's a lot of people that stand up there and talk a lot about geology, but never have drilled a well. They've never tested an idea. So, and also there's all kinds of commercial aspects around these congresses that I particularly don't like, because everybody is selling stuff, selling equipment, selling software, selling themselves, selling their jobs. We need to really find avenues to get ideas out on the table. So I think these congresses, with the participation and the help of APG and EAG, whatever, and SEG, but they should be commanded by the ANH, which has the vested interest in trying to reactivate the industry, and not only cocktail parties. The other thing is we have to be open-minded to have people from outside come outside, not meaning outside of the country, outside of the mainstream thought. It doesn't have to be a person from outside that comes with ideas. There's a lot of people inside that have good ideas. We should contemplate and give space for new ideas, ideas that are willing to be tested, and serious ideas, not somebody with a cell phone that can find oil with some kind of a ungüento or vendedores de pócimas and stuff like that, because I had a lot of those in Ecopetrol. No, people who are serious about what they're doing and committed and passionate about our profession. The other thing is about regalias. I understand that the regalias have been or are being modified. Part of the regalias should be used for this transition. Colombia es un país pobre. Va a ser forzado. We're going to be forced into being victims of a new era of resource management, and we have 55 million people with incredible poverty. You drive out of Uzma and you find people up in the hills that barely have water to wash themselves, and you know, hay que arreglar la pobreza before we can think about CO2. We have a lot of very important problems that we have to solve. It's un país muy sufrido. So I'm not here to talk politics, but it is our domain. If we're gonna talk so much about the environment as an obligation to humanity, we need to talk about poverty as well. And the other thing is we have to be candid about what we talk. You know, we went through the Opon area, we went through Coporo, we went through Palomas, we went through Gibraltar. Now we have Gorgon, we have Uchua. Put the numbers out. Let's talk about numbers. Let's not say, oh, we discovered. Let's put numbers and see what the reality of these things are. Is this really going to transpire into an economic outcome for the country, or is this just the end of a political era that we're going to promote ourselves, or my stint in Ecopetrol so I look good, or whatever it is, whatever agenda an individual is carrying? We have to be candid about what we do, because it's our credibility that is on the line as explorers in our resource. Okay, final chapter. I'm going to try to go quick. This is the situation. We all know Colombia has a 0.22% share of the CO2 output, and we're not particularly the most wealthy country on the planet. The countries who have wealth are the ones who have more options to do transition. As our boxer in Colombia, Pambelé, used to say, es mejor ser rico que ser pobre. We don't have a lot of options. It's very difficult to go and tell La Señora Mercedes in El Páramo de Sumapaz that has a wooden stove, to tell her to buy a Samsung stove and hang a solar panel and forget about burning wood. And we're talking here about 40% of the population of Colombia. So this is a situation that is not only in Colombia. Africa, Asia, and a lot of countries are in the same conundrum. So we're going to have to be carried by the countries who have the financial muscle, which implies that we will be in debt again for this transition. We will be in debt again for this transition. It's going to cost us a lot of money. So what we need to do is to be very calm about the way we do our transition and the way we use our oil and gas money to help us do this, so we don't go into full debt. Here's a typical problem. I'm living here next to Singapore. I can drive from here, Kuala Lumpur to Singapore. Singapore is an island that separated from Malaysia in 1965. Singapore had less GDP than Honduras in 1964, was poorer than Honduras in 1964. Today, with 5.6 million inhabitants, Singapore has more GDP than Colombia, that has 55 million people. The number is incorrect there. It's not 50.8, it's 55, I think, if I'm not incorrect. But anyway, 50 plus million people or survivors. We have 1 million square kilometers of land. Singapore has the area of Bogotá, Distrito Capital. And it imports 1 million barrels of oil per day to get the air conditioning and all the electricity to move. More than what Colombia produces in one day. It is important, and this is where oil industry has been very poor. We are being called always the bad boys because we were very greedy and we never educated humanity as to what we do. In simple terms, no con las leguleyadas y las hablados políticos, coyunturas, intersecciones, el win-win, the caveat, the synergies, toda esa basura, olvídense. We have to educate people at the level where people understand what we do and how it impacts their life. And the same thing has to happen with the transition to new energies. These are cartoons that you're all aware of. I'm preaching to the choir here. Everything we have around our homes depends on oil and gas. And us as a society of 9 billion people accustomed to instant gratification from WhatsApp, Facebook, and TikTok, are we willing to sacrifice all this stuff tomorrow to become all greenies? I doubt it. I sincerely doubt it. So these are the issues that we are confronted with. We are talking about sequestration. Sequestration is a great thing. We, as oil and gas industry people, probably understand a little bit better about sequestration than anybody else. What worries me about is monitoring. Well, first of all, who's going to pay for this? Because once the oil and gas industry stops generating the revenue, there's no incentive to inject CO2. Who's gonna carry the capex and opex for injection of CO2? Who is going to monitor the CO2 containment? How are you going to monitor the CO2 containment? Are you going to use fiber optics? What are the completions of the wells for CO2? What is the corrosion levels? How much workover do you have to do? Are you going to re-inject a well, a field like Las Infantas that has wells dating from 1918, which are all risky for injection because those are the first leak points that you're going to have to remediate before you inject. So these are all questions that me, as an ignorant geologist that I am, I'm asking. We have to ask these questions. We have to inform the people about these risks. Cars, beautiful cars. This is the first front of the transformation for CO2. Okay, I love it. I'm going to buy an electric car soon. That we have no issues with that. It's great. Electric cars are great. But we all know what it is. It requires lithium. It requires lead. It requires nickel. It requires magnesium. What are we talking about? Mining, intensive mining. Mining is a more dirty industry than oil and gas. People have to be aware that we are going in the direction of a much dirtier industry, which is open pit mining for resource. El Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, the first place where lithium, one of the richest places in lithium, es un patrimonio universal de la humanidad. It's going to be excavated. El cobre de Chile, highly intensive in water in a place where it hardly ever rains. We're going to use all that groundwater to the last drop. The resources are concentrated in a few countries, one of which is Democratic Republic of Congo, the poorest, one of the poorest and most suffered countries in the planet. We're going to continue to maintain them in complete slavery, where children are doing the mining in Congo. Are the environmentalists aware that the children are going to be digging for our cobalt with shovels? Do they truly understand what the issue is here? The battery disposals. Do we really understand when we start putting, vea los basureros de Bogotá, pile up all the batteries in el basurero de Bogotá with water raining and leaching into our groundwater? Do we understand what the groundwater situation is? We need to educate not the politicians, because they never underestimate the stupidity of a politician. They are not the people we need to educate. We need to educate the people, the common person, to do the right questions about our transition. And I'm all up for transition. But as we are being asked the hard questions, we also have to ask the hard questions of our future in the energy sector. There's countries where the resource is concentrated, and the countries who are now trying to dominate the change, which are China and the US, obviously have an economic interest to maintain the resource control, as they have done for 100 years. So we need to be very, very open in our way we approach this. And it's not to politicize it as much, but let's not go over this thing all over again. So I'm going to, there's one last issue I'm going to say about batteries. A common car is about 30 or 40%, battery operated is 30 or 40% heavier than a gas powered car. That implies that the roads, las carreteras de Colombia, que ya sabemos cómo son, are going to have tractomulas, electric tractomulas, that are 30 or 40% heavier going through the roads. La implicación there is that the roads are going to be crumbling. To reinforce the roads, you're going to need a lot more concrete. Concrete is one of the biggest generators of CO2 in the planet. All the roads and bridges around the world are going to have to be reinforced because they're going to be out of design for heavy transportation of battery-powered vehicles. So ask the questions. Let's ask the questions. There's all kinds of open things around here. I'm all for green. I actually don't have a car. I go on a bicycle everywhere I do. My footprint is very low, but I still catch planes, and I'm still like everybody, all of us. Let's ask the right questions. These are my consultants for the zero emissions in the future. So what people are asking us to be is go back to being a Papua New Guinea. So let's ask the questions before we go in this direction. And that's all I had to say. I'm sorry that I extended myself beyond my time, but I hope you heard and I wasn't talking to myself. But anyway, that's all I had to say. And thank you very much.
Okay, Pedro. Thank you very much about this great presentation that you had for us today. So if any of the attendees got any question for Pedro at this very moment, it's the time for questions. Doesn't matter at the end about the time. It's about a great presentation that opened the mind for different topics. And if any of the attendees, I repeat, got any question, feel free to ask it directly into the chat, and we can read it for our speaker of today.
I do want to apologize to anybody if I was a bit blunt but you know, as I said, I am who I am, straight shooter, and I love my profession. I love being a geologist, so I hope nobody gets offended. This is not personal to anybody. It's just an opinion that is probably confined to only to my brain. It's not the truth. It's just an opinion. So please bear with me, and I apologize if anybody felt a bit offended. But I'm open to any question or any observation. If you have observations of something that you may have a total disagreement with, I'm very open to having a conversation. So yeah, anything, just shoot. I worked for DuPont, so I have Teflon, I have Lycra, I have Kevlar, I have all the products of DuPont. So
There is a question at the chat, Pedro, and it says, with the experience that you have and the different personal opinions that goes hand in hand with the current national and world thinking, wouldn't you like to promote or to come to Colombia to promote those changes that you are talking about?
yes, I think you know, Colombia. Look, the transition is something that Colombia can benefit enormously. Just think of Costa Rica. Costa Rica has been capitalizing out of nature for the past 20 years, bringing tourists. And with no offense, I don't want to offend anybody in Costa Rica because it's a beautiful country. But Colombia has a diversity that is enormous compared to Costa Rica. Costa Rica fits in Antioquia practically. So there is a lot more about transition that Colombia has to offer. It still has a beautiful country. It has a lot of water resources. So it has alternative energies. It has a lot of wind. The royalties can be focalized centrally, not to the province, to do this transition, but slowly use the oil and gas money to help us get from point A to point B. And in the meantime, capitalize about the transformation in tourism, in all kinds of other things that Colombia has to offer. We had so much political strife and people were afraid to go to Colombia. Now Colombia is like one of the places that everybody wants to visit. So there is a whole thing around this. There's an opportunity for us in the oil and gas industry to do the last beat of conventional resource and making money. Use that money to do the transformation. And in the meantime, turn Colombia into an attractive place for people to visit. So there's massive opportunity to here. So this is not a negative. I don't have a negative view of it. I just need, people just need to be aware, everybody, la gente común, hablarles común y corriente a la señora de la plaza de mercado, hablarle de manera sencilla qué es lo que está pasando. No, not in terms of the politicians. So that's my few cents of experience. That's what I want to say about this. We can still find, todavía se pueden encontrar bastantes hidrocarburos en Colombia, bastante, en cantidades pequeñas, pero todas suman, con agresividad de creatividad. Sí, cuéntame, hay otras preguntas por ahí que están saliendo. La transición podría tener un fondo económico más allá que una genuina preocupación por el medio ambiente. Sí, claro. Bueno, eso es una pregunta que puede tener dos filos, ¿no? Hay quienes tienen intereses de utilizar esto como una manera de hacer plata. Hay gente que no es genuina con la transformación. Ellos lo ven como una oportunidad porque es una moda también. Como es TikTok y todo. Entonces, ahora la moda es ser verde y hay gente que capitaliza con eso. Y hay otras cosas de ser verde, por ejemplo, solo la alimentación. En Colombia en Estados Unidos venden comida orgánica. Pues en Colombia casi todo es orgánico. Pare usted en el paradero, en el comedero de la carretera. Eso está sembrado ahí it's all cultivated right there on the ground. It's all organic at a price that is not organic. So efectivamente, the transformation has all kinds of derivations. We eat in Colombia, people still eat organic food with not organic prices, because the people who fabricated all this organic industry is a little bit, that's why you have to be skeptical, a little bit like the people of the CO2 thing, that are there's a group of people, and I'm not saying everybody, but I'm sure there's a group of people that are capitalizing on the fear to make money. That's why education is so important. That's why you don't go to Carulla to buy organic food. Se va más bien uno a Corabastos y todo está orgánico. Exactly. That's the problem. Any other questions out there?
Yes, we got a question that related to the equipment that the oil and gas industry has. It could be done with this equipment, some geothermal prospection with high enthalpy.
Hello?
Did you hear me?
Oh,
Sorry.
now I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question here by Diego Venegas from Ecopetrol. He's saying like, great talk. Thank you, Pedro. With equipment that the oil and gas industry has in this very moment, it could be done some geothermal studies or surveys or prospection with high enthalpy?
Yes, there's, as a matter of fact, leaders in this camp are Philippines, partly Indonesia, la isla de Java, tiene 65 millones de habitantes. It's about the size of Cundinamarca, and it has 22 volcanoes. También Chevron, desde hace mucho tiempo, tiene un programa, has a program of geothermal energy with them. So there is open literature about all this, and New Zealand as well. And one of the most self-sufficient countries in geothermal energy is Iceland. So all this, my understanding is that the UPME in Colombia with the ANH, they've done maps of alternative resources in Colombia. What it requires is a bit of verification and quantification, which includes part of this, how you mobilize the equipment, what kinds of equipment you're going to use, what the cost of these things, what the risks are involved. So it's not only the maps and the numbers given by economists, but also the verification and the technical aspects, which are provided by engineers. The oil and gas industry has all the troop of engineers for injection, which is EUR, recovery, injection, and also for geothermal energy. So it's a proper question. Correcto, estamos en lo mismo. Estoy de acuerdo.
Okay, there's a question by Sofia Arnal. She's asking if, apart from the CCSU, the carbon storage, what other techniques can we use to decarbonize the exploration sector?
Yeah, there's actually carbon capture equipment. There's used in, for example, in Scotland, and in some European countries, in Norway, they have these massive contraptions that are built on land that actually, as the wind blows, captures the CO2, which is basically by plain chemistry. There's plants, there's soils to capture CO2. There's carbonates capture CO2. There's all kinds of mechanisms to capture CO2. The issue is that in Colombia is that it has to be for Colombia puede ser artesanal por ahora porque nosotros no somos unos grandes impactadores, but eventually it'll be at an industrial scale. So tiene que tener cierta organización. So people can people can contribute, or certain provinces and small entities can contribute to carbon capture in many ways. But eventually there has to be a concerted way in which the country will have to do this. Most of the pressure will come, for example, if Colombia in the future needs to do a road, or has to do a dam, or has to lay down whatever project, the banks or the International Monetary Fund to provide the loan to Colombia will ask for the CO2 compromise, or the CO2 actions that the country is doing in order to receive those funds. So this is the future of the world is in the hands of the people who have the money, and that's where we have to be very careful. So there's multiple ways of capturing carbon, and I'm sure that Colombia, la gente muy recursiva, and they will inventarán cosas endémicas a Colombia within the context of the Colombian topography and within the context of the Colombian resources. So there's a lot of options in CO2. The most critical thing about all this problem is that we're 9 billion people in this planet, and 9 billion people, which we are very few willing to sacrifice having a cell phone, having a car, having to go A to B in 15 minutes, having everything quick gratification. Most, and especially the young generations, who have no patience whatsoever, because they're the TikTok and the Facebooks, they want answers immediately, Google immediately. So those people are going to have a massive adjustment. We are overpopulated. The problem of CO2 is that we're too many people in this planet. So now we're going to have to deal with it. Complicated.
We got the last question. It says that there is an evident link between mining and metals and the oil industry. So to what extent did you see that in Colombia?
Pues está el Cerrejón, y está Cerro Matoso, y están las minerías de oro en Antioquia, con las consecuencias que tienen, ¿no? That's why mining is complicated. We're going to change it. Nickel is going to still be there, but just think about it. All the materials that you're going to need for the alternative energies are going to require intensive mining. Everybody is going to have batteries in the house, because even if you put solar panels, that energy has to be stored in capacitadores and in baterías. Everybody's going to have batteries. That implies that you're going to have to intensively mine the world. Y la minería se hace a boca abierta, la mayoría, y es tremendamente destructiva para el planeta. Tremendamente, son unos huecos enormes con maquinaria. La maquinaria me imagino que serán también operadas en baterías, no sé, la retroexcavadora en diésel haciendo la minería. So just think of all the problems that this has. Y una vez que tenga unos huecos, ¿cómo los vamos a rellenar? Y vamos a reforestar. Y cuando acabemos un hueco en un lado, vamos a hacer un hueco en otro lado. So our future is difficult. Our road ahead is not easy by any means. By any means. The electrical cars have, I don't know, 50 or 60% of it is made out of mining, porque todo el plástico que tiene el carro es hecho de petróleo. El tablero, el radio, las llantas, todos los empaques de caucho, everything is made of petroleum. Las latas del carro son acero y hierro, minería. Las baterías, minería. Los cables, cobre de Chile y de Australia. Las pantallas del cuarzo, todo. Los chips electrónicos, todo. Everything is mining. Human beings, we need all this stuff. So if we trickle down on the oil and gas industry, we come down, another set of problems are going to arise. We better be prepared for these new challenges. And I don't think a lot of the people who are very green are thinking about what's ahead of the game. As long as they understand what the situation is, okay, let's all try to do our best. But let's not get into surprises, because eventually all of us, the geologists, us, are the bad boys always. In oil and gas or in mining, we're going to be the bad boys. That's why our profession is kind of dying. So yeah, so that's the situation in the future. I don't know if the question was done by somebody who's young, but I hope you have these conversations in your phone, or in my time, we used to do them tomando aguardiente. Now it's all on the phone. But so we need to have these conversations. Serious.
Okay, Pedro. So
Yeah.
from the ENH, we thank you very much for this excellent talk. The importance of having a proper surface geology in order to interpret the whole geophysical thing that we got below.
Yeah.
And the whole thing about how the new environmental stuff and how the energy is changing, and from a rational point of view. And the ENH will take advice of all of the different advices that you have given us for the future. So thank you very much, and thanks to all of the attendees. And we will have you next week. We got a Friday off. So in 15 days, we'll be back with a special guest, Carlos Molinares, for reservoir characterization for CO2 capture. So thanks again to Pedro, and thanks to all of the attendees of today.
Very thankful and very grateful for the invitation. I appreciate it very much, and I enjoyed it. So surface geology and strat traps, fast and furious. Let's get on with it. Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye.